My name is Charles Tilburg. I'm the Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and this is the third of the Core Connection lecture series on disaster. And I'm particularly excited about this series because we've linked it with the 4 themes of the core curriculum for the College of Arts and Sciences. The first 2 from last semester were environmental awareness. The next 2, Dr. Button's and then Dr. Adamson's talk, which is going to be in March, are on social global awareness. Next year, we'll talk about critical thinking and citizenship. And so the idea is we've brought in a couple of scientists and a couple of social scientists to show everyone here multiple lenses in which they can look at one particular event or one particular relationship. And so here we're looking at disasters, and we're going to look at it from both the scientific side, which we did last semester, and this one we're going to look at how society views these particular events and how media looks at them. And so I'm very excited to bring in Dr. Button, Dr. Gregory Button, and he was kind enough to give me a bio so I don't have to stumble through this. He's an internationally recognized disasters researcher. And it's particularly exciting because Dr. Button is both an academic. He has been at the University of Michigan for 13 years, and then he's now at the University of Tennessee-Knoxville. But before that, he was a reporter. And so he's looked at this both through an academic lens and through a real-world media lens. And so I'm particularly excited to hear what he has to say at a bunch of different disasters. He's looked at Katrina, he's looked at different tsunamis, he's looked at the Love Canal, he's looked at a bunch of different things. And so he's going to bring a very long and involved history and experience to us to tell us about, I forgot the title, iconic events.
Oh, yeah, right.
Rethinking iconic events.
Everyday disasters, rethinking iconic events.
Yes. And so I'll turn it over to Dr. Button to tell us all about that.
Thank you. First, a disclaimer, in some sense. I've been trained in both the hard sciences and the social sciences, and I think that's great. And I think in today's interdisciplinary and complex world, I would encourage all of you to take that kind of avenue of exploration and education because we need to look at things like disasters and climate change through multiple lenses. And there's a lot that we can gain from studying both the sciences and the hard sciences. Also want to thank you for inviting me here. It's a real treat and honor. I didn't know very much about this college before I accepted. I have to admit, growing up in New England, I was just biased by the fact that I was going to New England. But I'm really impressed with the core curriculum and the focus of this college. And if you're students here, you're very fortunate indeed to have such a unique curriculum and focus and to be situated in such a beautiful landscape. So keep that in mind. Okay, I'm going to try and do a lot today, but hopefully I can do it in a way that won't get too out of hand. I wrote a book called Disaster Culture, Knowledge and Uncertainty in the Wake of Environmental and Human Catastrophe about 3 years ago. And basically, the core of it was looking at the way in which we deal with the notion of uncertainty in the wake of disasters, particularly scientific uncertainty, and how commonplace that is, and the ways in which that uncertainty is used and abused in the wake of disasters, sometimes distorted by people who might be implicated in the event and try to downplay it or accuse scientists of creating junk science and sometimes in return creating their own junk science. And so it's about disasters, and it actually comprises several case studies I conducted over several decades, but it's also at the heart of it about the notion of the production of knowledge, which I'm very interested in. Because I think that the media and public policymakers and politicians play an incredible role in that, as well as corporations before, during, and after disasters. And I think it's important we understand that thoroughly. This book is the second in a trilogy I'm writing about the production of knowledge and disasters, and it's looking at it through a critical lens of actually looking at how we as academics perceive disasters and how we have defined them and the need for us to reimagine them and for to fully comprehend them in their fullest context. And And at the same time, it relies on case studies. And the first case study, as you'll see shortly, is one of the first major environmental stories I did for NPR. I was fortunate enough to work on Love Canal. And I think it's an incredible event, an important event. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I'll explain it briefly. In this new book, I actually look at several case studies going back from the late 1970s up until the present day. In fact, actually, because there was a delay in publication for technical reasons, I just have finished a chapter that might need to be altered a little bit on looking at the chemical spill in West Virginia, because that has to be seen in the larger context of what we call the Kanawha Valley and the history of chemical accidents in that valley over the last 3 decades. And this is, I think, the most recent example we can use to illustrate some of my major points. So let me bore you a little to begin with, to read through just a couple pages to give you a little bit of a theoretical background, and then I'll talk to you about Love Canal and one reason why I think it's a good jumping off point for us to explore this event. The interrogation of disasters is as much a history of knowledge as a history of uncertainty and environmental disasters. How we as scholars interpret, shape, and organize knowledge is of critical importance. We must not only reflect on society's production and organization of knowledge, but on our own production as well. How we theorize and problematize our inquiry into disaster and define its objects is critical to our understanding of such events, and equally important of society as a whole. We need to relocate our question and push the boundaries of scholarship and redefine the boundaries of disasters in their context in radically different ways than we have to date. In other words, our examination of disasters requires a major epistemic and conceptual shift and calls for a new kind of knowledge production. Disaster clusters. Any strategy for the production of new knowledge must inevitably begin with how to conceptualize the object of study and how to define the field of research. What gets anthropology and social sciences its analytical edge is to challenge perceived wisdom and to think outside the conventional box. One goal of anthropology should be to focus on the concepts of disaster, which are considered axiomatic and unproblematic, and explore its different meanings and how it works as an organizing principle of culture as well as of science. Analysis requires seeing beyond specific details of any particular disaster, albeit the specificities are really very important in and of themselves. To look at wider patterns found in similar cases. We usually perceive disasters as isolated and abnormal events. What is missing from this perspective is that disasters are grounded in a larger social, political, and spatial context. Therefore, we need to see instead to see environmental disasters as routine, normal, and connected to one another along various social fault lines, and as a direct product of our culture, and not something to be imagined as simply an exceptional event. We can no longer think of disasters as simply isolated cases. To see disasters as processual is a very different approach than one that has traditionally dominated disaster studies in all fields, science and the social sciences. In doing so, the process challenges us to think about disasters, where disasters begin and where do they end, and how sometimes they're imbricated with each other in uncanny ways. Environmental catastrophes and disasters in general are not isolated events. They are embedded in what I call disaster clusters. Unfortunately, we tend to pay attention to the iconic disaster events, Hurricane Katrina, earthquake in Haiti, et cetera, while ignoring the larger context in which they occur. The media devotes considerable attention to disasters like Love Canal, or Hurricane Katrina, or many others in current day, but fail to cover adequately and understand the everyday threats I call shadow disasters. Disasters which remain invisible to almost everyone but the affected communities and the environs. In other words, shadow disasters are normally blotted out by all but the local media at best. They seldom, if ever, make the headlines, and they are forced, often in vain, to struggle harder to gain recognition, assistance, and justice they deserve. In fact, even for some of our iconic events, and I'll talk about this briefly, For every disaster story like Love Canal or Hurricane Katrina or the earthquake in Haiti, there are hundreds of similar events that never gain media attention or come into the public eye or recognized by disaster researchers. While the magnitude and severity of the event may to some degree determine such oversight, there are many significant neglected disaster stories that are never told. The news media tends to, and to a lesser degree, but a significant degree, academia as well, almost exclusively focus on melodramatic events, which serve to galvanize the public perception that disasters are random, exceptional events, not as common and ubiquitous as they really are in everyday life. Even those disasters that are eventually gain national attention, like Love Canal or toxic waste contamination in childhood leukemia in Woburn, Massachusetts, can sometimes take years to gain national prominence and come to the attention of public health policymakers and the media. As I've argued elsewhere, the media's news analysis is episodic, it's not systemic, and it therefore leaves out the kind of analysis that would place disasters in the larger context of society, translocal and otherwise. Academia, to a large degree, is difficult of the same sin. However, what this neglect also achieves is that it prevents disasters from simply as isolated events rather than being part of our everyday life, which they are. We're surrounded by them. The first day I teach my graduate seminar, I put a map up, and it's usually the most recent FEMA map of every major disaster, major being in, not in caps, declared by the president over the last decade. And there's a gasp in the room because while everybody thinks, oh, it's too dangerous to live in LA or it's too dangerous and risky to live in New Orleans, when my students see the map, they see that almost every county in the United States in the last decade has had a disaster declaration by the White House. And those are only the ones that politically get that recognition. So we live in an environment that is very vulnerable, and there aren't necessarily any safe refuges. The thousands of other disasters and all so-called incidents waiting in the wings to be recognized as disaster events serve to make this abundantly clear for both the media, government agencies, politicians, corporations, or even researchers. To recognize this fact would require they reveal the true social arrangements of our culture and the asymmetrical balance of power that sometimes produces disasters, as well as the kind of environmental disruptions that we create around us that make disasters sometimes worse than they might well be. Disaster clusters articulate cultural practices which span many locations over time. These clusters should be seen as assemblages, which, among other things, record both the rigidity and the transformation of our cultural landscape. If we are to more fully comprehend disasters and learn from them, we need to look beyond the iconic disasters and peer into the shadows. For it is in these shadows we can truly discover the silent struggles of people and their communities and the environs of what James C. Scott refers to as everyday forms of struggle, or what Eric Wolf has often said to be about a people in a landscape without history. What I am suggesting is that it makes a significant difference if we look at and examine disaster clusters instead of just looking at disasters as isolated events that we deem to be most sensational and iconic. And perhaps one way to illustrate this point is to examine the history. And in this book, I use an example of looking at toxic waste over time as an example, but I also talk about how we could look at any other form of disaster in the same light. I just use this for historical continuity for the reader, and I outline ways in which we could look at other forms of disasters of all kinds. And so today I'm going to talk about Love Canal. And I know some of you are probably too young to even remember Love Canal, but it was a significant event, and it was a defining event in many ways. While Love Canal is certainly not the earliest example of an environmental disaster, it is one whose legacy shaped our culture's perception of risk and hazard in almost immutable ways and engendered a larger debate about how to protect citizens and the environment from unregulated corporate activities and how a government should protect its people and the environment from potential harm of such events. Deeply embedded in this debate is how we as citizens and public agencies, the media, legal systems, scientists, actually deal with scientific uncertainty, which lies at the heart of the debate. The events of 4 decades ago, that is, Love Canal, engendered an ongoing controversy that still lingers today about, for instance, many things, including the health consequences of toxic waste exposure in Love Canal. Some claim the uproar over public health was a media hysteria, while others claim the incident was a non-event, whereas even others persist in insisting the short and long-term harmful effects of the event on both the human community and the environment. Whatever the final judgment, the nation's imagination was seized by the event and the concern that it generated over the disposal of hazardous waste. And eventually this event was so important that it was primarily responsible for the passage of CERCLA, which is the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation Liability Act, otherwise known as the Superfund. And that was a really important event among many of the environmental legislations that were passed in the 1970s. The story of Love Canal so troubled the nation that it inspired a number of studies that provided us with some of the earliest insights into the contested space of an environmental destruction, environmental illness, and disasters in general. There was even a contribution on the literary front. Novelist Joyce Carol Oates, who was born in Niagara Falls, wrote a novel about Love Canal. It was published in 2004 called The Falls. But it generates so many other academic books, of which there are about half dozen, which I won't name for you in the interest of time. All of these accounts provide us with the insights about how technological and environmental disasters present almost irreconcilable accounts and illustrate how difficult it is to disentangle contested versions of a single event and resolve claims about science, about public health, about environmental impact and environmental pollution in general. So that ends the more formal aspects of the talk, and what I want to talk to you about is Love Canal, and give you a brief summary of it and some of the reasons why I think it's important. And one of the reasons I think Love Canal, among many, is important is that it is, in my opinion, our first chemical corridor of what we call Cancer Alley. And some of you may not be at all familiar with that term, but that's a term that's assigned to the area from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, in which there are many petrochemical and chemical plants there, and a huge minority population, which underscores the need for the notion of environmental justice. And they have a highly disproportionate amount of cancer and other illnesses affiliated with toxic waste that are there. And so in the modern mind, particularly in younger generations, we associate it with that. But I think we really need to begin to look at these kinds of disaster clusters, at least as a good example by looking at Love Canal and some of the implications there. So we're going to take a little bit of an historical overview, which I think is important in trying to understand this event. And I think you'll be surprised at how much this event extends into the modern day and is not simply an event that's over. And during question and answers, please remind me to talk about disaster continuum, and I'll make it even clearer to you why we want to take this kind of overview. Okay, so let's just start here. Niagara Falls is interesting because obviously it has Niagara Falls, right? It's in upstate New York. And during the Industrial Revolution at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, it became a place in which a lot of industrial plants and manufacturers wanted to locate to because of cheap, available hydropower. And it actually is, well, I mean, I'm sorry that this doesn't have more clarity or lucidity, but you know, here's New York State, here's Niagara Falls. And what we found is because of the Niagara Falls area, there was a huge boom in chemical plants and chemical-related plants on both sides of the border as a result of the location of Niagara Falls and being able to husband all that energy. Now, to show you another map, might hopefully be clearer, but hard to read. This is a map that was produced by the Chamber of Commerce in 1925, the chemical industry in Niagara Falls. And while you can't read all this, you can see that there were a lot of chemical manufacturing plants in this area at this point in time, fairly early in our century. And one of the things to keep in mind is, and this was something that was done in all industries, was that industrial waste and byproducts were dumped usually on site or in some adjacent water, swamp, or river. In this case, in the Niagara Falls area, we had it being both dumped in the Niagara River and into the land most adjacent to the river, so that it seeped into the river and into all the water tables. By the late 1940s, there were over 140 chemical plants in this small, tiny area of the United States. And with the advent of the production of synthetic chemicals, which began at the beginning of the 20th century, but really took off in the 1940s, when we have since produced over 80,000 chemicals in the environment that didn't hitherto exist, nor to which we have much knowledge about how they both affect humans and the environment, nor do we understand how synergistically they might interact and affect us in other ways. Along with this growth came a guy by the name of Hooker, who built Love Canal. And Love Canal, or Love, who built Love Canal, very timely name for a canal in the 1970s, you know. It became eventually Occidental Petroleum Chemical Company. And he built this canal. It was about 10, 12 miles long, several hundred yards wide, and he built it adjacent to his plant, and he was using it, of course, to use hydroelectric power, but he also dumped in a little bit over a decade, he dumped at least 250,000 pounds of toxic chemicals, of which we don't know the admixture of. We do know there are things like lead, arsenum, and mercury, so that raises a flag for those of us who know public health in general, you know about toxicity. Unfortunately, along with that, because of its proximity to Manhattan Project conducted by the U.S. Army, they happen to have dumped, and we don't know quite the figure because of security, but we think they probably dumped several hundred pounds of radioactive waste. We know it's there. We've been able to detect it. So this became a really toxic area, needless to say. Well, after a while, Hooker was concerned about this toxic waste and liability and kind of wanted to get rid of it because they knew it was just, well, a witch's brew, as it were. And so they came up with a clever idea. Because of the growth, largely because of the chemical plants in that area, there were adjoining suburbs that popped up, and the site had previously been empty. But this area in Niagara Falls, Love Canal area, became a growing community, and the school board needed a new elementary school. And so for just the price of $1, they were sold a large portion of Love Canal, and the school was built on top of this canal. Okay. Now, if you think this is an unusual story, I could give you over 100 different instances in the last 4 decades this has occurred, so don't think that this is an unusual juncture in history at all. So, okay, so what happened? Well, at first nothing seemed to happen. People seemed to build their houses, the school grew, but then all kinds of early warning signs occurred, and it didn't really erupt until the late 1970s. But in the interim, what began to happen is, among other things, people noticed an odd odor in their basements and their houses, and then eventually they began to get a seepage of all kinds of black, gooey stuff coming through the basement wall. And in some cases, because of the way in which this toxic waste got down into the underground swells in the surrounding little suburb, entire backyards would just disappear or sink, and created a bunch of what the kids called black lagoons, and the adjacent area outside these homes. And the kids loved to play in them. You know, it's fascinating. Well, eventually, unfortunately, a number of kids came down with cancer and other kinds of toxic symptom presentations in the school, and there was growing concern. Homeowners realized they were losing the values of their homes. They were concerned about their health. And they began to develop what we call in public health, you know, a cluster of diseases that raised a lot of questions. As in most cases like this, the local municipality didn't want to hear about it. Local politicians, they felt it would devalue the town, bring negative attention, stigmatize progress and growth in the community. But fortunately, 2 people changed the course of history here. One was a man by the name of Lester Brown, who was a local journalist who was first rate, and he wrote over 100 articles on these stories in local newspapers, and he eventually gained a lot of attention because of this. The other was a woman named Lois Gibbs, who was a hero in the environmental movement. She was just a housewife, largely uneducated. Her husband worked in the chemical plants, like many people who lived in this suburb, and she became very concerned and very active. And while she had no organizing experience or scientific knowledge, she became one of the leading environmental organizers in the country. Parenthetically, just as a note, it's interesting if you look at community organization and activism around environmental events, the majority of times it's women who are the organizers and the ones that create these organizations. So in terms of gender, That's an interesting footnote to history. So eventually, the stories that Brown wrote and the uproar created by demonstrations organized by homeowners in the area, more and more attention was paid to the issue. And this reluctance of local government finally had to some degree, change. Eventually, the New York State Department of Public Health became convinced, although they turned a deaf ear on this for a long time. Lois Gibbs' brother-in-law was a scientist who taught at the University of Buffalo, and he began to look at the information and say, I think there's something legitimate here. And he helped her find a toxicologist who actually became involved in the project, and then eventually another toxicologist who actually worked for the state of New York. And they began to come up with some convincing, interesting evidence. And this is one of the first examples we have in our history of what we call participatory kind of research. That is where you have both scientists and local people organizing this kind of health research and conducting epidemiological studies. Another great example of that is the toxic health issues around Woburn, Massachusetts. Because today it's a model used by many communities where both scientists and social scientists like myself work co-jointly with communities. And we try to conduct epidemiological and toxical research to try and confirm whether or not there's any problem here, and then work with authorities whenever that's possible. So in 1978, the New York State Public Health Department could no longer ignore this issue. They had other major environmental issues on their plate, but they couldn't ignore it. And they issued a report saying this is a serious problem. It alarmed a lot of people. At the same time, people in the community felt like at last someone's listening to us. Now, what I've neglected to say so far, and is really a key point in this story, is the fact that, see if I can get the map, the fact that, well, Love Canal came to our attention and became a benchmark environmental event, and I apologize for these municipal maps, they're not that good. One of the interesting things about Love Canal is why it captured our attention. I think there's two primary reasons, obviously, that I hinted at. The articles of Lester Brown and the organization of Lois Gibbs and the women in the community. But it was not by far the largest or the most toxic waste site in the Niagara region. There was at least 50 of them, some of them 5-6 times larger. People were suffering similar ill effects and problems in the communities, but it never came to the attention of the Public Health Department, to the media, to the nation at all. Love Canal became the one that drew the lucky straw, okay? We have a disaster cluster here. We have several toxic waste sites at this point in time in the 70s surrounding this entire Niagara region on both sides of the border, but particularly in North America. We've ignored them to this day and the implications of them to this day, and I'll get to that a little later. So when people were convinced by and large, the majority, that there was a problem, they wanted New York State to do several things. They wanted them to conduct epidemiological studies. They wanted them to actually test their homes, test their water systems, examine the children, and try to explain these cancerous effects. And actually, to give you an example of a kind of a brilliant early example of lay science participation, New York State came up with many theories of which downplayed the potential that there was any harm. But working with an epidemiologist and toxicologist and householders, they did a map. I can't read this too well. This is an original copy of the original map that Lois Gibbs did. And they decided that the underground swales were the pathway of entry, as it were, speaking in public health terms, that actually contaminated the community, that these swales acted as almost arteries, highways, which these houses were affected. And they mapped the community, and they found that every place that these swales went, there were clusters of houses that had not only childhood diseases, but there were stillborn births, childhood maldeformities, genetic diseases, at a much higher rate than anyone would expect, okay? After a while, because of their concern, they asked to be compensated. They wanted New York State to relocate them out of, especially the houses that were most disproportionately affected. They were concerned about the loss of their property values, more concerned about the health of their children. The state was reluctant at first. They didn't want to get involved. They thought it was too costly. Relocating people is always a politically a difficult decision for any municipality or state to make. So eventually this became national news. This protracted debate. It got into the papers. These women protested in various ways, indicative of the 70s, and the federal government could no longer ignore it. And in fact, it came to the attention of President Carter, who I interviewed about this, and he finally decided the federal government in some way had to intervene in this event. So they became involved in it along with the state. And very shortly, this became international news, and certainly news broadcast all over the United States. It became the iconic event of the decade. There are other smaller ones. We can talk about those later if you want. This is the signal event. So eventually, New York State, with the help of federal government and some financial assistance, decided to relocate some of these families, move them out of their homes. There were some difficulties with this because, and I was one of the only journalists that wrote about this at the time, but there were really inherent environmental justice issues here because while most of the people who lived in these suburban houses were lower middle class, some working class people, all white, there was an adjacent apartment complex of, I think, over 100 apartments, the majority of which people were either very unemployed, lower class, and the majority of which were African American. They wanted to be relocated too. They were in the midst of this. Their kids were being exposed. Their apartment houses and grounds were being exposed. But because they weren't homeowners, and they weren't white perhaps, they were ignored. And it was very expensive for them to relocate, but indeed they had to, because not only did they have to break a lease and forfeit that money, but they also had to put up 2 months' rent in advance. And that's a lot of money for people who are low income. So they were ignored. We didn't pay too much attention at that time. Today, of course, they probably would. So people were relocated. Some people weren't, and it's always kind of arbitrary. If you look at any, I tell my students, if you look at the way in which people judge which areas ground zero and which not in the wake of a toxic waste or environmental disaster, it's often declared by the court. Sometimes the judges never go there. And it's odd. It's odd because there's no internal logic to it. So there were people who were excluded from being moved, though they were adjacent to the swells or had children who were sick or had stillborns and other maldeformities in their families. Some progress was made. Well, about 5 years after, so I should also say large areas of this place were just chain link fence. They were off ground. It became a no man's land. And then you can go there today and see huge areas which no longer seem to have many houses in them because they've kind of sunken into the ground and everything has been set aside, and some of the toxic waste has been capped and placed there, albeit controversial, and I'll get to that in a moment. There were people who were still left behind, who either just got out, abandoned their homes, or stayed. And then some wags in New York State decided, you know, nothing's happened in the ensuing years, 5 or 6 years have gone by. Why don't we take some areas of this no man's land and sell the land to people so they can build homes and buy it? And unfortunately, a lot of people, some people had knowledge of this controversy and some people didn't. Many people didn't, and they bought these homes at bargain basement prices, and most of them, they were lots that they built on. And make a long story short, we'll get to in a minute, they also started to begin to have problems because they were living on top of this toxic waste, and many of them were angry that there was no disclaimer saying, hey, by the way, did you know? And just because it was in the national media, that doesn't mean a lot of people knew that there was this problem. Seems like the end of the story, right? We're up to about 1984. It's not, because in the ensuing years since then, the toxic waste sites have more than doubled in the Niagara area on both sides of the border. And in fact, we are finding that many of these, what I would call in my introduction, shadow disasters or sites, became more manifest. And there are a lot of people now who are crying the fact that after 4.5 decades or more, they have problems with their homes, with their health, et cetera. The fact that in many ways the disposal of toxic waste has improved slightly but not very well. The fact that there isn't enough Superfund money in that area to declare all these areas Superfund sites in general. That's a different thing we can talk about later. It has to do with the failure of Congress to support the EPA and Superfund sites in general. And then there's this. The people who are living in those homes that they bought or built on that reclaimed property and toxic health now are beginning to have the same presenting symptoms that the people did in the late 1970s and 80s. And so now, all of a sudden, and you'll see this only in the regional papers in Niagara and Buffalo area, you're finding people telling very similar stories. It's almost like we've gone back in the time, but we're many decades later and we're facing the same story. And the challenge is, what will New York State Public Health do about it? What will the federal government do about it? Some people are saying, well, it's not a direct result of the toxic waste disposal in Love Canal. Of course, other people argue differently, and people always have differing opinions in the wake of these kinds of events. And I tell, incidentally, my students, and you should keep this in mind, if you ever go into any area that's affected by a disaster, any other kind of problem, and everybody says the same story and tells you the same thing, that raises a red flag with me, because people have different opinions and different ideas and hold different views. So in this case, while now we're beginning to see these families come forth and these issues being raised about health problems that seemingly are related to, but we have no direct public health correlation at this time, to this area, we're beginning to see this story mount again. And it remains to be seen whether this will actually become a national news story or anything will become of it. But in the interim, all the environmental and public health groups in the Niagara area have begun to they actually conducted an incredible study from a scientific and social science point of view and released a 200-page report about 7 months ago documenting how much a fluorescence there are now of toxic waste sites, even though we have the Superfund site and everything else. Keep in mind, one of the problems with the environmental legislation with Superfund sites is it isn't to prevent pollution or toxic waste contamination, it's only to remediate it. And when you don't prevent things, then you end up having severe problems. And most environmental legislation is not good with that, and Superfund in particular, aside from the fact that it's crippled from the lack of funds. There are hundreds of sites that have been preliminarily designated as toxic waste sites by the EPA. They can't do anything about it. They don't have the money. They don't have the manpower. And many of the sites they started cleaning up years ago in different parts of the country remain kind of on a holding state because there's just not time and personnel to deal with the problem. Okay, so that gives you an idea of something, at least in this particular case, of the toxic waste. But I want to push it just a little further, and then we can open up to questions and examples. And there's lots of ways we can look at this around the country, because what I've done in my research is to try and kind of identify over the last 60, 70 years where we might have these toxic waste clusters just in general. I'm bringing out a new book that I'm co-editing with a colleague of mine in which we talk about this in the context of other forms of disasters. But I'm using toxic waste as case studies in this case to make my argument. So now this is not a map that's comprehensive enough, but it's one at least that you can read. And you will see this is the entire Great Lakes area now here. And so you go from Niagara Falls, you go over to Detroit area, you go over to the area in Ontario. And while you only see some red dots, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of toxic waste sites surrounding the Great Lakes area today that didn't exist there even 30 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. And it's a concerned problem to people. It's a concern to Sea Grant researchers, Great Lakes researchers, in general. It's a concern to environmentalists, it's a concern to public health people. But we've seen this fluorescence, this huge growth of these toxic waste sites creating this huge cluster, somewhat separate from but related to this initial cluster that began around Niagara Falls. Okay. So I guess I kind of leave it at that because I want enough time for questions and answers, and I'm sure you have a lot of curiosity. And I've tried to give you kind of just an overview as opposed to blow-by-blow description, because it might be too tedious in some ways, a little bit too detailed. So with that, questions?
Yeah. Thank you. I wonder, you mentioned a number of times about the lack of funds for the Superfund and probably other kinds of similar cleanups. So in your experience, how does government, maybe especially federal government, response to natural disasters, Sandy, for example?
There's no such thing as a natural disaster.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, whatever.
Yeah, disasters.
Right, sorry, disasters compared to, the Love Canal example or other Superfund sites.
Well, yeah, they're different things, I think. I think that's a good question because we're not dealing with toxic waste. We not necessarily deal with cleanup, but what you don't know is we are dealing with cleanup with Hurricane Sandy. So first I'll answer that question, and I'll try to answer the broader, larger question, which is good. It's detailed in a different way, and it's determined by our response to disasters as prefigured by 9/11 and post 9/11, okay? So in terms of Hurricane Sandy, it's interesting because one of the most affected areas in the 5-borough area is Staten Island. Okay, let's talk about Staten Island for those of you who don't know. It's always been an island, even though it was the headquarters for the Dutch when they first settled the Manhattan area, but it's always been the dumping ground for almost the beginning for, you're shaking your head, you must know the area.
No, I just know that that's its reputation.
Yeah, right. So especially the whole North Shore has got a lot of toxic waste sites, Superfund sites, and what we call brownfields. That is sites to be determined to be polluted but have never been cleaned up or attempted to clean up. And it also had until about, I guess about 5 years ago, the largest toxic waste site in the country and one of the largest in the world that was put there. So all the toxic waste from the greater borough, Manhattan, tri-state area was dumped on Staten Island, right? And so along comes Hurricane Sandy, as they say. And what happens is two things. One is, in the wake of many disasters, in one of my chapters of my book, I write it on a great length when I look at the New Orleans, Gulf Coast area. One thing happens is you get a storm surge like that, and you flush out all the Superfund sites and brown sites. So everything that's even been capped often gets redistributed all over the area. It's a mess. It's a terrible mess. So it creates a huge environmental problem with that. The second thing that always happens in the wake of a storm like that, the kind of eruption where it actually creates a lot of toxic waste. Think of, and the best example, but Sandy is by no means not close to it, is with Hurricane Katrina. So you have a huge amount of waste, right? Every refrigerator, every stove, every household, every chemical plant, every Superfund site. And so you got all this toxic waste, and it's dispersed all over the place, and it's made the environment less salubrious, more threatening to the environment and to people. What do you do with it? Well, usually what you do with it, if you do anything at all, is you just take it to someplace else. Well, other places don't want it. And the story around Hurricane Katrina is fascinating, but we probably don't have time to get into it. So in terms of Sandy, one, now it's more despoiled on Staten Island. The other thing is, the New York State municipality would like to take all the waste from the tri-boroughs, the 5-borough and tri-state area, and put it on Staten Island. Hey, you guys are already screwed. You might as well just put it right there, Naturally, people in Staten Island are not happy about this, okay? That's just a kind of a thumbnail sketch of that. Your larger question is somewhat disparate, but it's interesting in the sense that disaster research in this country began being funded in a robust way after World War II because people worried, what if we had a nuclear holocaust? How would people respond? So the federal government, in the interest of national security, started funding all kinds of research on anything from a tornado to the disasters to see how communities respond, how resilient they are, what they do. And so we have a lot of federal research as well as private funding research over the last 50 years that has taught us a lot. Unfortunately, in the disaster community, both science and social science, we call it lessons unlearned because it's very hard to take what we learn and translate that into policy, which is one reason why I've always been so interested and involved in policy. And basically, we've come up with a unique model that no one else in the world has. We got it under the Bush administration. We still have it under the presidential administration of President Obama. We have a command and control model. It's highly militarized. It works from the top down. It has several intervening layers. It retards quick response, adequate response, and a host of other things I won't get into you with, but suffice it to say there's a lot of problems with it. There's no other government in the world that has that response. And it's one reason why we had such high mortality and morbidity in the wake of Katrina, as well as other factors that were the result of negligence because they didn't want the federal government to get that involved. So 9/11 really distorted our response. Now, prior to 9/11, actually we had for a while something that made both of us in the academic research community and in EPA very happy. We had something called Project Impact, and Project Impact was a kind of a brainchild between those two fields of endeavor, and it said, look, research shows us the most resilient, best way to respond to any kind of event is from the bottom up. And you have to involve the federal government and regional government and stuff. But you have to empower them, you have to work there. And one of the things you need to do is start putting aside training and money to prepare for and prevent disasters, because those of us who've been studying for years say, I'm sick of studying them, I want to prevent them. And so too did they in the EPA. So they started Project Impact, and they appointed a number of cities as pilot projects for Project Impact, and everyone was so happy that this was the new future. This happened under the Clinton administration, just toward the end of his administration. And then, well, as promising as it was and as much money and energy went into it, there was a major earthquake beginning of the Bush administration in Seattle. A major one. I mean, most people don't realize Seattle's more vulnerable than LA from a seismic point of view. But they did really well. And one of the reasons why they did well, that even the mayor and both Republican and Democratic councilmen and other community leaders and NGOs would say is Project Impact really taught us how to prepare for, respond to, prevent things, and then kind of get back on our feet quicker than we might if we were dependent on these other programs. Now, here's the great irony, and I cannot explain this to you. But within 24 hours of that statement being made by the mayor of Seattle, Project Impact disappeared from the website of FEMA. It's gone. Okay, why? Well, Vice President Cheney said it was a threat to national security and it didn't work. We haven't heard from Project Impact, and we haven't been able to get anything like it since then. Among the other things that happened post 9/11 that answers this question in part is that once we created this behemoth Homeland Security, which is the largest agency, it's just huge to manage. One of the things that the Bush administration began doing is what we call decapitating FEMA. They wanted to actually downsize FEMA, put more power and response into Homeland Security. And to do that, first of all, they fired a lot of lifers who worked for FEMA for years, who had an institutional history, and many of these were great people and knew really how to respond to things on a regional level and a national level very quickly. And then they drove out some of the people who were actually at the higher echelon. That's why we call it decapitating. They fired them or told them, you're retiring. You had a great career, we're out of here. And then as a result of that, there was so much demoralization within the agency, a lot of people just resigned because they saw they were on a sinking ship. So FEMA today barely resembles anything it even was then. And Homeland Security has such a hierarchical, bureaucratic way of responding, and a very militaristic way of responding that has never been revitalized or changed even under the present administration. So when you look at a tiny disaster, they argue, well, we did well. Well, actually with Sandy, they didn't do too well. There were a lot of things that FEMA and Homeland Security failed to do. But that aside, many of us are worried that if we have another major event like Katrina or anything of that scale, we're going to have a real problem because we don't have the institutional mindset and the kind of imperatives to work with communities and respond in an effective manner that we have hitherto. So it remains unseen. Most of us are not optimistic about it. And I'd love to be wrong, okay? Does that give you okay. Other responses, other questions? Yeah.
Here you go.
So I'm going to try to challenge you to expand the notion of disaster, because that's really what you're pushing for, right? So Love Canal, toxic waste disaster, and so that's an example,
yeah.
Or the non-natural disaster that often gets represented as a. So what about economic disaster? And I'm sort of curious about possible sort of this idea of sort of disaster clusters. Detroit, for example, right now is getting a lot of press. Of course, that's just one example of a kind of significant community sort of decimated in some ways by changes in manufacturing, shift, a lot of stuff, right? Another example of the kind of economic disaster I'm just kind of thinking about here is military contract time, right? So is Boeing going to get the contract? Is somebody else? And if Boeing doesn't, then, right, there's a sort of economic impact. I'm not sure we want to quite call it disaster, but certainly if you lose your job, it's a disaster. There's this old sort of economic saying, right? When the U.S. gets a cold, right, the rest of the world gets the flu or pneumonia. And so there are, potentially, while we might think about like these hotspots of economic disaster, I'm curious about, you mentioned that you're bringing out an edited collection which would maybe have many different perspectives on different kinds of disasters. I don't know if economic disaster fits in some of that framework that you're talking about, but I want to see.
Well, good question, yes and no. First of all, I'm not qualified to really answer that question. I'm not an economist. I have looked at disaster every way possible through every lens, and I certainly look at the notion of political economy, economic fallout, regional fallout, reasons why political economy could affect disasters or set them up in place. But I don't know about financial disasters. I'm not authorized to answer that question. I just go beyond my keen. I'm not a scholar in that area. I'm co-editing with a colleague a series of books for an international publisher on disasters. There's going to be 10 of them. And one of the volumes we want to put together addresses that issue. We're the senior editors, but we're right now trying to find economists. That notion of an economic disaster has not, in that largest sense, not in the sense of there are economic implications of disaster, has not been addressed by disaster scholars in general. Although, some economists look at disasters and look at insurance or look at compensation or things like that. But these broader things, which you correctly call disasters, are not something that have been part and parcel of disaster research. Okay? So hopefully we'll be able to look at that more fully in the future, but right now I can't speak with any authority. Any questions, comments?
So you and I talked about historical perspectives. How do you think the sort of pre-modern U.S. Folks dealt with disasters, and how did that work out? Earthquakes, whatever.
Yeah, well, very interesting. It's a history, of course, that goes back to the beginning of our republic, and historically up until actually the 1930s. And even then, federal government and state governments have been very resistant to do anything. Okay, they didn't want to play an active role. They didn't see the imperative of playing a role. There were attempts to introduce various legislation after the fires in Charleston, after the earthquake in Charleston, after the Madrid earthquake in the early 19th century, to have some kind of policy in the public arena, either state or federal. And it's been resisted right up and basically until President Carter created FEMA, and even then it's wobbled because there are some people on the right who say we have no business doing it, and some people who say we should, and to the degree to which we should, and albeit though we have laws on the books. In recent years, a lot of Republicans have cut back the funding and the political power of a lot of the legislation that was passed in the 70s, ironically under the Nixon administration, so that they kind of cut back our ability, even though we have the laws on the books and the policies on the books, to respond in an effective manner. So historically, we've always had this contested debate about what the role of public policy should be. But basically in the 20th century, and with the increasing advent of disasters of larger scale and the recognition that a disaster, say in the Madrid area fault or in San Francisco area, today has more important impact than it would have in 1919 or 1916 because it affects regional, national economy and security. So we're taking a look at it in a very different way. But to sum it up, historically, really until the mid-20th century, while it was debated and introduced, and most people thought there was no role for federal government, and often on a state level, depending on what state you're talking about. There were some interesting ideas, though. First of all, because there was a lot of water pollution going on because of the advent of the Industrial Revolution, that some very early laws were passed to try and prevent people from dumping it into waterways, rivers, not groundwater, not swamps, not lakes, not ponds. And ironically, and I say this because someone worked on environmental and oil spills a lot, is the first passage came, I think it was in the mid-1870s, and it was a small act that was passed to prevent people from dumping oil into riverways That was the precedent. And then later, because areas around New Orleans and other major urban areas, even St. Louis, were starting to have problems with water, and in this case particularly toxic waste, there was the advent of beginning some laws and attempts being passed to regulate it, sometimes on a regional, sometimes on a national basis. Some of these laws failed, some of them succeeded. And the early question was, how do you even regulate it? Because we didn't have many really robust regulatory agencies then. So it became an interesting problem. Now, what's interesting about it historically is that the role that public health and wildlife, marine sciences, and water sciences have played in this debate, and I have to take my hat off to those of you who are marine scientists or water scientists or involved in that, because early on in the debate, there was a belief within first what we call the sanitarian movement and then the advent of public health that, actually toxic waste was good, that we should actually promote it because it'll kill off viruses and bacteria. And so, what's the harm? In fact, why should we interfere? And then you find around 1916, 1917, I read so many journal articles on this. Some people in public health were beginning to debate that, but remember now, we didn't have the science and the tox and the epidemiology to even prove anything. It was basically a he said, she said kind of debate, but some people were dissenting and saying, I'm not so sure we want to introduce these toxic wastes in it. A case was made early on for arsenic and mercury because we knew it was very toxic early on. We didn't need to make that argument. But here, now, at the same time, simultaneously, if you look at the wildlife, water, marine sciences publications, they were saying, you don't want toxic waste in your water systems because we know that it affects the flora and the fauna in the water. We know that it kills off fish. We know that it changes the chemical balance of the waters. And so you had this kind of occasional debate between what we might call public health and the wildlife sciences arguing on different sides of the field. So really, if you look at some of the best arguments made and the people who were pushing within their profession for regulation, it was really in the biological sciences, wildlife, hydrology, et cetera. It was not in public health. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. It was enlightening, and glad to have you here. You mentioned one lesson learned perhaps from your research is that things starting from the bottom up may be more effective in terms of dealing with disasters. I wonder, I'm not looking for detailed how to respond to a disaster, but what other big lessons does your research and others studying this tell us about what other ways to deal with disaster have been helpful? Kind of broad strokes.
That's kind of a long list, but basically, first of all, it's to prevent them, which is not something that we've had a lot of public policy or research around until about a decade or a little earlier ago. And also monitor them and use science and technology in ways to anticipate them. In the environmental arena, we've been making arguments that actually what happens is, and I told you I should talk about the disaster continuum, so I will right now, and I'll use this as an example for your question. I and a few other researchers came up with this idea of disaster continuum. The disaster continuum is that within public policy, media, public perception, we basically looked at a triggering event and we said, okay, a hurricane came ashore in Katrina on August 29th, whatever, that's the beginning of a disaster. And then basically the public, the media, the political response, policy response usually lasts a very short period of time in the wake of that before it's over. Well, the problem really is it precludes few things, including the notion of a chronic disaster like Love Canal. And many disasters which we label today as disasters that were initiated, like Katrina, actually are embedded in the notion of chronic disasters. So, for instance, if you have a disaster like toxic waste, which will illustrate the point in one sense here, it really began in the late 19th, early 20th century. It was a cumulative process, and it just so happens that eventually, because of persistence of certain people, at a certain point in time, all of a sudden we got Love Canal. It didn't happen overnight, okay? We can think of countless examples of that outside of toxic waste. But the example I was using yesterday, and I was talking to you about this, is we look at environmental degradation and the way we interact with our environment, we can look at even a longer historical point in time. And a good example of that would be Hurricane Katrina. Because actually, we set in motion a series of triggering events, as we call them, right after the Civil War, the advent and the growth of the Army Corps of Engineers, because they were so eager to actually recanalize the Mississippi River and build levees. And if you read John Barry's book on 1927 flood, you'll get a wonderful, interesting historical overview about the ongoing debate. There are people on both sides. People on one side said, don't mess with it. It's going to create problems down the road. And they listed a whole series of things in which they basically proven to be true to. But the Army Corps of Engineers prevailed. They recanalized the rivers, you know. They built all these levees. So one of the problems with that is there's natural subsidence along the whole Gulf Coast where land subsides. And then basically, historically over time, by and large what happened is it was a zero-sum loss because when the mouth of that huge Mississippi River brought all that siltation down from North America, it kind of infilled that land. And so you didn't lose as much land. But since we recanalized it and we built these levees, that land keeps subsiding. So every year they lose the equivalent of at least a couple, 3 miles of coastline because we've lost that. Other things that we did that were triggering events is that when you started doing offshore oil and gas in the 1920s and 30s, what you needed to do was to have pipelines go to shore to deliver this product. Most people don't understand it. If you got on a boat and you got out there, you'd feel like you're in Manhattan. You know, there's so many of them on the Gulf Coast. And one of the problems with these pipelines and canals is they widen every year, double in width. And by now we have tens of thousands of them. What did they do? Well, they eroded the coastline because one of the things that actually deters hurricanes is that when it comes to shore, once it is shore, it slows down pretty quickly. But when you start creating all these inlets and wide gaps of land, you're destroying the swamp, the marshland, that ecosystem, in more ways than one, but in this particular case, loss of landmass. Along with that has come a lot of, and even though it's illegal now, but for many decades, the harvesting of cypress swamps. So, you know, we could have mulch in our garden. You destroy the cypress swamps, well, you have less and less coastal land further moves in, okay? Now, what I tell a lot of people is that Hurricane Betsy and Hurricane Camille, a couple decades before Katrina, were actually larger, worse storms in many ways. They had less damage done to there was less mortality, morbidity. Certainly there was some flooding in parts of New Orleans. But New Orleans, because the Gulf Coast was denuded in such a way that when it happened, the Hurricane Katrina, that hurricane moved shore very quickly and did not slow down. It should never have gotten into 75 miles of land at that high of velocity. And one of the other key factors is that we also created what we call a highway of death. And that is during the 1960s, we decided, or the Congress decided, a much debated controversy, to build what is a Parkville project, and everyone will admit that now. People argued if we built a canal from the outer coast, 75 miles, inland into downtown Detroit, we'd have an inner city port. And that would just bring an economic boom and progress, and that would be wonderful. And some people argued, you know, that's not a good idea for environmental reasons. And some people said, well, I don't know if there's a need for it. Well, historically, they built the project beginning in the 60s. It has hardly ever used. It was kind of a boondoggle project. Then, about 3 years before Hurricane Katrina, I was on a panel of other scientists, about 19 of us at the University of New Orleans, and we were trying to figure out what made the coast vulnerable and the ways in which people were vulnerable. And one of the many things we said in this report, and it's sad to say that most of what we predicted proved to be the absolute scenario that happened in Hurricane Katrina that bothers a lot of us to this day, but it had predictive value way beyond what we imagined. We said, look at Mr. Go. The problem with that is it's going, if that hurricane gets anywhere near there, that'll just provide the most easy access into the area. So this is what happened. The mouth of the hurricane just happened to, for a variety of forces, enter into what we call Mr. Go. It went up this area and over, it kind of goes like this from the Gulf Coast and arcs over the lower part of New Orleans. And it comes to where there are a lot of levees, which had already begun to break, but it came right adjacent to the lower Ninth Ward and St. Bernard Parish, which is Chalmette, the city of Chalmette. And at that point in time, it had a tidal wall that was 30 feet high, literally. It crested that tidal wall. It inundated all the lower Ninth and Chalmette in water up to the rooftops for up to 2 weeks. And in Chalmette, which is a much bigger residential area, you had water in all but 5 buildings in that whole parish, municipal, retail, private home. And this is a footnote, we could get into it later. There was also a major oil spill that further complicated that. In the lower Ninth, and in that area of Chalmette that was hit by that tidal wave, the majority of mortality and morbidity from Hurricane Katrina occurred. That's where we had the greatest loss of death and damage to both infrastructure, human health, and the environment. So you see, we can create vulnerability in ways that we need to anticipate and be involved in. And that's one reason why a lot of us, and the majority of us, say there aren't natural, unnatural disasters. We have to look at the way humans shape our environment, interact with it, and also respond to it. Because if you look at something like the Exxon-Valdez oil spill, the response of Exxon and the way it went about it, it's a detailed story. I argued in my dissertation, later other people argued, it made it worse. And in some cases, they created more damage than even the spill did because of the way in which they responded, you know? So that's why we're concerned about the interaction between people and the environment in general. Does that answer your question?
That's good.
Yeah. Okay.
So let's go ahead and stop there. And if you still have questions for Dr. Beth, he's going to be around for a couple more minutes before he has to go back to the airport. But let's leave him that.
Thank you very much.